Okay, can I welcome everyone to our 70th anniversary lecture. My name's Mark Baker. I'm a Professor of Urban and Regional Planning in the department and the current head of the Department of Planning and Environmental Management. I don't want to take up too much of David's time or present an official history of the department tonight, but I thought I'd say a few words about our 70 years. We actually became a separate department of the University of Manchester in 1952, so you're probably now thinking, well, we're a year out anyway, it's 71 years then, but we're taking this to be our kind of academic year because we were formed, I think, before the 52-53 academic year. And we also did mention our anniversary back at the end of last summer when we had the UK and Ireland Planning Research Conference. And I'm actually delighted to see several people that were that have been able to join us again today. We originally formed out of architecture, and I think there were earlier postgraduate diplomas in planning going back to the 1930s. And back in 1952, there was a handful of staff, including, I think, Clifford Holliday as the head of department at the time, and probably 20 or 30 students. We've grown slightly since then, and obviously established ourselves as one of the major centres of professional planning and education and research in the UK, along with the likes of Liverpool and Sheffield and UCL, Newcastle and so on. By the time I joined the department, and one or two other faces that I can see around, we had around, I think, about 14 or 15 staff. And we'd started to branch out a little bit from the mainstream planning courses that we did at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Today, we've got about 200 to 250 undergraduates, including probably the largest ever intake 2 years ago of about 90 in 1 year, which is really huge. Not all doing planning, some doing environmental management. But if that was a kind of growth, it's been in recent years the postgraduate side that's dramatically grown. So we now have over 300 master's students on our books, over about 8 or 9 different programs. Those include the kind of long-standing MSc planning, which is the kind of continuation of the turn geographers and engineers and other people into professional planners type course that's been going a long time. And that now has about 50-odd students doing it each year. We've reintroduced in recent years a Masters in Urban Design and International Planning. In a sense, that's perhaps a resurgence of a stronger design focus that probably existed back in the 1970s, 80s, 90s in the Roy Kantorovich years as head of department. And also, you know, we had Lewis Keeble on the staff going way back, and so it kind of fits. That course also now has about 60 students doing it. And as part of that, we've also recently established what we call the MUD Lab, Manchester Urban Design Laboratory, and got some new facilities in our studio space in our building. Though nothing like it has to be said when I first came here, in that the whole top floor was studios, half of it architecture, and you know, a studio for each course each year on the undergraduate programme. We also do, still, and looking at Chris here, the Masters in Environmental Impact Assessment and Management that I think you established back in the 1990s. Caris has been running it for many years, and that's actually has got the highest number of students it's ever had, at about 50 plus now doing that course. And our BA in, or BSc now in environmental management kind of links back, I guess, to the landscape planning and management course established by John Hanley around that time in the 1990s. And finally, again, looking at the audience, we've kind of got the MSc in Urban Regeneration and Development that I think Gwyn was responsible for setting up around that time as well. And that's also got 20 or 30 students doing it. Delighted that Chris and Gwyn could join us. So we've also got a long-standing tradition of research in both urban and environmental planning, taken forward by 2 of our current research groups. One of them with the rather long name of Sustainability, Resilience, Nature and Built Environment, and the other one, Spatial Policy and Analysis. But one of the most recent developments, and probably the biggest development in terms of student numbers and so on recently, has been the establishment of both a new research group and a teaching programme in real estate. So we now have 8 real estate lecturing staff, including a dedicated professor, Professor Anupam Nanda, who's at the back. And the undergraduate course that we now run is actually called Planning and Real Estate, and is a 4-year course that's dual accredited by both the Royal Town Planning Institute and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. So the department continues to evolve, and it always has done. Over the years, it's had several different names, including town and country planning, town planning, planning and landscape, and even just planning. Currently, it's the Department of Planning and Environmental Management. But in the light of what I've just been saying, it's or the intention is to rename it, if the university powers that be allow it, by the beginning of next academic year to Planning, Property and Environmental Management, to reflect the kind of real estate grouping now. And all this history, in a sense, brings me neatly to introducing this evening's speaker. I just said we've recently developed an interest in real estate, but that isn't exactly true. In the earlier days of his academic career, around the, I guess, the late 1980s, early 1990s, David was a lecturer in this department, lecturing in land and development and development process at those times. And in a sense, therefore, is an excellent speaker for tonight when I'm talking about bridging the divide between real estate and planning. That is what David does. So David is an emeritus professor in urban studies at Glasgow University, a Scottish Land Commissioner. Up to his retirement in 2019, he held the Ian McTaggart Chair of Property and Urban Studies at Glasgow. As well as Manchester, he has previously worked at the Universities of Aberdeen and Reading. He's a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences, of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors and the Royal Town Planning Institute and the Royal Society of Arts. He has researched and published widely in state market relations in land and property, with a particular focus on planning and land use policy, real estate developers, speculative house builders, brownfield redevelopment and place quality. His research projects include work on the value of planning for the RTPI, as well as on land reform more generally. So I'm therefore delighted to welcome David to give tonight's talk on the topic of planning and land ownership, time for reform. And so I'd like to invite David to give his talk, after which there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session, which will be chaired by Professor Cecilia Wong. So, David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Delighted to be back here in the university where I indeed started my lecturing career, and to see quite a number of old friends in the audience. What I want to do tonight is to draw on academic research, my own and others, but I also want to draw on experience of leading a community group and as a board member of the Scottish Land Commission. Obviously, have to say that I'm speaking entirely in a personal capacity and not seeking to represent those organisations. So I'm going to start with the book that Steve Teasdale and I published 10 years ago called Shaping Places, Urban Planning, Design and Development. And it's a book that explores the interaction between planning and real estate. And it argues that planners are actually not in control, even if they think they are. But it does identify ways in which planners can turn the balance of power more in their favour. Well, out of that, the focus tonight is going to be on the balance of power between local planning authorities, landowners, developers, and local communities. And by landowner, I mean anyone with a property right or interest in land. So that often includes developers as well as what we would call pre-development landowners. I'm going to be arguing tonight that the balance of power in recent decades has shifted towards property interests. And I'm going to suggest that redressing that requires a radical programme of land reform. So let's start with two stories. I always like to start with stories to ground what I'm saying. And of course, I'm going to start with two stories from Scotland. See if it works. So here's somewhere in Scotland that has seen better days. Then, let's see if it works. And now. And actually, it's even worse now than the pictures suggest. Try and see if you can just get this working, because it will help. I'll use this for a moment and I'll take this. So what do we hear? The slide actually sets out the basic facts, which I'm not going to reiterate. What we have is deliberate inaction by a hard-to-reach private owner that is creating a permanent eyesore and actually a threat to public safety. The council's power of interventions are limited and taking place under the building, not the planning acts. The direct cost to the council is estimated now to run into at least 7 figures, maybe more. And the indirect costs to locality are incalculable. But the key point I want to make comes from the council's leader's comment, which is almost despite all the obstructive ownership, the council is remaining reactive. So let me move to another example, somewhere I know very well. And we're looking at this little area of green space, the foreground of the photograph, with the Gairloch in the background. So what happened to the little area of green space? Again, it's a story that is repeated many times in many different places up and down the UK. And it raises difficult questions. Were the councillors unduly influenced by a very limited planning gain offer, which then looked a large offer, but it wasn't, and an offer that was seen by local people as buying a planning permission? Or were they rightly swayed by the need for some housing on the site and the pressure to save construction workers' jobs? But why, despite the development plan and the office recommendations, did the community have no effective redress? And is it any surprise that rewarding land speculation does create widespread, but I have to say unfounded, suspicion of backhanders passing to decision makers? So those examples demonstrate the vulnerability of planning, on the one hand to owner inaction, on the other hand to owner speculation. And in his 2017 paper, Bromley talks about property rights ownership traditionally regarded as a black box by planning. But every piece of land not only has a use, but it has a value and it has an owner. Planning has tried historically in 1947, 65 and 74 to address issues of use or of value, and more recently through all the debates about planning gain and SIL and planning obligations. But Grundberg's suggestion argues that the presumption of neutrality in terms of ownership and the appearance of objectivity, I'm going to argue it's only an appearance, creates major problems. Now, of course, you'll have many, many different interests in planning, and planning is much, much wider than land and development and so on and so forth. But what I'm going to be talking about today, managing land, is actually quite at the heart of what a lot of planning does. So ownership is power. And the power of owners derives as much from the rights of property as it does from their financial backing. Now, nominally, students are told almost in the first year of lectures that development rights in the UK were nationalised in 1947. And that might be the case legally, but actually the initiative, development prospects, depends highly on the initiative of the property rights holder. And property rights are deeply entrenched within the system and are reinforced by the European Convention on Human Rights. So again, what we find, and a lot of my own work has been directed towards this is the way in which active ownership can be a catalyst for placemaking and change and development. But passive ownership can create the kind of serious problems I've shown you there. And I could repeat that time and time again with different examples in Scotland. And there's a range of ownership constraints that impede development. And I will suggest that planning really does not engage thoroughly with those and is weakened by not engaging. So, not so far away from the little piece of land I showed you is Castle Woods. Even stronger protections of the woods, whole series of environmental protections, but a planning application for 60 affordable, and when councillors see the word affordable, their eyes light up. 12 market homes and the remnant formation was basically the remnant as a commercial wood. Same landowner, same local authority, same community group. You have to guess what happens next. I shall tell you later on. Just bear that in mind. Local planning authorities, almost by the nature of what they do, are in day-to-day dialogue with developers who have the privileged rights of appeal. And communities are third parties. They generally have no property rights. They're excluded from the direct negotiations about land. And it's almost as if they are looking in from outside as to what happens in their area. Indeed, Scotford and Walsh in 2013, a very good paper in the Modern Law Review, argue that the privileged position of property rights holders gives them, quote, a distinctive voice in the planning system and a greater capacity than they should have in democratic decision-making processes. And there's a very good paper by Andy Inch on really how this works out on the ground from his research in Scotland. And he finds that with limited time resources, citizens are constantly struggling to keep abreast with development. It's happening almost behind the back. And that reinforces the scepticism, and that reinforces, in due course, the lack of support for planning in the community. So it's not just an issue about first party, second party, third party rights. It's about whether planning is going to have widespread support in a community and widespread political support. I like this cartoon. Rob Cowan does a lot of excellent cartoons. We never promised you a level playing field. Well, of course they didn't, because developers are in the privileged position. But what struck me was when this whole issue was debated at length when the Scottish Parliament went through its last reiteration of planning legislation. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of submissions. And 84 community and environmental organisations, key movers and shakers in, should we say, third-party stakeholders, lobbied and petitioned Scottish ministers for equal rights of appeal. What happened was the RTPI of all people, led a counter petition by business and professional bodies. And I think that my own personal view was a shame, and I think it was shown to be so, because if you read people like Hugh Ellis, CPRE, if you read even the recent Rainsford review, talks about a more balanced distribution of rights. And what one ends up with is what I thought was quite an interesting comment from one of today's leading practitioners in a recent issue of the Planner, who, as I say, this topic is much, much wider than just appeal. It's about the whole substance of support for planning. Many of the current problems in the plan making stem from the fact that communities feel planning is something they have little influence over, yet the outcomes are directly imposed on them. So we have to ask, why does this happen? Why is it that planning differs to owners and developers? And to be realistic, planners in the UK have few powers to tackle urban dereliction. And they don't build houses directly, so too often they find themselves reacting to external events and pressures. And the shift to what has been characterized as reactive planning, that shift has accelerated over a period of 40, 50 years. Diminution of proactive planning is explained in the literature, and there's a lot of writing around this, talking about neoliberalism, hollowing out, reduced role for the state, and a lot of emphasis on the word delivery, which I must say I don't like the word. It reminds me of the chap coming to deliver my post, but there we go. Emphasis on delivery puts planners at the mercy of delivery agents, whoever they may be. Well, they're very largely located in the private sector, as planning's direct capacity to control delivery is quite limited. So again, let's break from sort of the generalities and let's look at a particular case study, a particular story that I think encapsulates a lot of what I'm trying to say. And this is Neverland, whose story I have followed for a long period of time, and I eventually decided to write with some colleagues to write the story up in detail. And this is Nottingham city centre. And just to the southeast of Nottingham city centre is an area of about 11 hectares. It started to become vacant when the Boots factory moved out to the periphery of Nottingham, and then the railway lines closed, and various other things happened, and you ended up with fragmented ownership at about 11 hectares. So here is the piece of land in 2014, when it had already been vacant for 24 years. And here's another shot of it at the same time. Now, the interesting thing about Nottingham East Side is there were 4 major master plans, none of which came to fruition at all. So here's the first one, which is what Boots came up with to try and up the value of their land when they were moving out. A World Trade Center, massive commercial redevelopment, £150 million it was estimated at, and 2,500 new jobs. And again, another word that councils like is new jobs. That came to nothing. A much more low-key type of proposal from the company who bought it, talking about sort of campus office development and workshop development. But again, 2,000 jobs were promised in all the headlines at the time, came to absolutely nothing. So we move on to 2002, when Latham Architects produced a rather grandiose scheme, but interestingly enough, it started to bring water into the site to create an ambience for residential development, to try and lift the value and lift the potential that way, but it came to nothing. And then the Hopkins Associates scheme in 2004, 270,000 square meters, mixed-use floor space, prime offices, luxury apartments, shops, bars, restaurants, leisure space, new public space, new canal basin, £900 million. That was hit by the global financial crisis, came to nothing. So when you've lost 4 master plans, what you do, you bring in Tesco. But Tesco had to produce something sort of slightly out of their ordinary, so they proposed what they called an ecological superstore, which you can sort of see has a bit of a green roof. 11,000 square metres, much smaller, and the councils were only promised between 300 and 500 jobs with this. That came to nothing. So we sort of think, well, what did the leader of the council have? And we'll come on to him. Just some lessons. First of all, it's very easy to be taken in by grandiose plans that are, in the end are meaningless, are just that. The city council was largely reactive to successive schemes as the developer and landowners came and went, and the paper tracks a whole series of different names who were in charge of this site at different times, and it simply passed from one hand to another, and different schemes came forward. The council threatened CPO, first of all in the late 1990s, and then again towards the end of the period. They had acquired part of the site on what they call a back-to-back deal, which was simply that this day they buy it from someone and that day they sell it on to someone else. They hadn't actually checked who they were selling it on to as to whether the people they were selling it on to were likely to do anything with it, but a deal was done and it was privatised. Now, the paper is about the efficiency of property led regeneration, and the argument in the paper is this is not simply inequitable, it's not simply unsustainable, it is also a highly inefficient way to develop land. And the argument being that the lack of collective action, the lack of planning, actually increased the development risk for the private sector and made what might happen much less likely. And what we have is half a planning system. The futility of trying to manage urban development without having any control over land ownership. So I said we'd ask the leader of the council, and there he is. What did he have to say? And he had to say what many leaders of councils in similar situations would say. We've done all we can. We've got a bit fed up after all these years. I think the question I would ask John Collins is, that's not really what planning's about, surely. Surely planning can be doing better. Surely planning should be doing better than this sort of kind of reactive messing about mess. So what might be an alternative strategy? And again, very, very diagrammatic, but it places the reorganisation of land ownership at the core of achieving effective placemaking development. It's about bringing together the fragmentation prior to development, managing the consolidated ownership and distributing it in a way that creates different sized development opportunities for different types of developers. And in that way, creates the sort of diversity you want in an urban area. Diagrammatically, all those blocks are the same. They needn't be. They can be all kinds of various of different sizes. But crucially, that alternative strategy requires what we might call a place promoter, a master developer, an initiative taker of some sort, to produce a master plan, to assemble the land and subdivide it into different parcel developers. So who are these place promoters? Actually, across most of Europe, the municipality operates as a place promoter. In the UK, the tradition has been more in terms of the public sector, new town development corporations, Homes for England, or whatever they're called these days, urban development corporations. There's case studies in the book about public-private partnerships, about single entrepreneurs, which is an example of Seaside in the United States, an entrepreneurial club, which is perhaps a neoliberal way of doing the same thing through contractual arrangements between private developers. So the role of place promoter can be undertaken by different types of actor, but the public sector is commonly in the lead. And what needs to be done is conceptualizing the diagram, which is what the place production process ought to be about, is effectively about, of avoiding the kind of mistakes and the kind of delays that we see at Nottingham East Side. So having set out the problem, let's look at the road to reform. Where do we start? And reform can be achieved partly within planning and partly by connecting planning to wider land policy and land reform. And I'm going to cover these broader areas of policy first and then return to planning in more detail. But the key thing is a change in mindset, a change of planners to realise that they're actually participants in market processes, already involved, already market actors intimately involved in framing and reframing property markets. So the call there, getting back to my start of my lecture, is for planners to recognise the interconnections between use, value and ownership and become equally concerned with all of them and with the interconnections and not simply confine plans to use. So let's connect planning now to land policy and land reform. Land policy is all the ways in which the state seeks to intervene in the use, exchange, value, ownership, management and development of land. The diagram there is a superb report called The Land of Scotland and the Common Good, which covers almost all the aspects of land reform in Scotland, from wild deer fishing right through to compulsory purchase and housing supply. And it was produced by an independent advisory group and was a landmark report that generated the last set of land reforms in Scotland. But it defined land reform as measures that modify or change the arrangements governing the use, the possession and use of land in the public interest. Now, I would distill it even further to say that what land reform is doing is it is challenging ownership power, confronting ownership constraints, changing ownership behaviour. And my plea today is those aspects of land reform need to be integrated and connected into planning for planning to be far more effective than it is. Now, since 2013, 2003, Scotland has been at the forefront of land reform in the UK. And I'm going to be referring to three major pieces of legislation, the 2003, the 2015 and the 2016 Acts. And there's a new Act about to come in shortly. So the 2003 Land Reform Scotland Act was actually a rural measure. Those of you who love walking on the hills of Scotland will talk about the right to roam. And the right to roam was embedded in the 2003 Act. It also established what's New Zealand called a community right to buy, because it was actually a right to be given first refusal. But it did impose compulsory purchase powers, compulsory community right to buy in the crofting areas in the Highland and Islands. And for a decade after that, the challenge for people like myself was to suggest that land reform was not simply a rural issue, that the principles of land reform were as applicable in towns and cities as they were in the countryside. But one of the key things that piece of legislation did is it started to provide the basis for the community right to buy and the growth of the community ownership movement in Scotland. That is linked to the Scottish Land Fund. I'll talk a bit about that. And what I want to be able to argue is that the growth of community ownership turns communities from being third parties, which planning sees them as, to active participants, which is what land reform sees them as. The subsequent legislation, the Community Empowerment Bill, extended the community right to buy to the whole of Scotland. It encouraged asset transfers, and they introduced for the first time the possibility of communities initiating the equivalent of compulsory purchase of land that is abandoned and neglected. The 2016 Act introduced the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. It set up the Scottish Land Commission and a further potential compulsory community right to buy to further sustainable development. And that would apply, for example, a rural community that said that the laird is preventing affordable housing in the area because it doesn't want any affordable housing near its estate. There's now a legal procedure whereby the community, going through a whole host of a whole host of stages to go through, can potentially force the laird to release land for affordable housing in a community. So that is just an example of the way things are going. The Land Rights and Responsibility Statement was introduced in 2017, revised last year. I haven't time to go in all. But just taking two of the key principles from what is a generic statement of how landowners should behave in Scotland. It talks about a human rights approach to property rights, a belief that landowners act as stewards for society as a whole. And it reflects the kind of concepts of property, the social function of property, explored recently by Benjamin Davey in a very, very good article on planning theory, of challenging what perhaps is a UK-based historic view of property as an individual right. The Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement is pressing on property as a social function, and that then has an implication on policy. But that goes back a long way. When I was in Dublin, I took this photograph, intrigued me. I didn't know who he was, but the plaque at the bottom, property has its duties as well as its rights. I thought I would take a photograph and find out who he actually was. Thomas Drummond was a Scottish Army officer who became Under Secretary for Ireland in the early 19th century and had fierce criticism at the time of the large landed estates in Ireland. And that endeared him so much to the Irish people that on his death, the statue was commissioned, and not simply it's commissioned, it's still there 100 years after the British left. And his view is consistent with Stocklin and Lewis, who see property as a social institution. There's a lot of philosophy around this, and we get one end of it in this country, but there is a lot of philosophy of saying property is a social institution as well as an individual right. And such theorists are said to understand property as a socially constructed institution that serves and is subject to human values, thus entailing duties as well as rights for owners. So one of the results of the 2016 Act was the setting up of the Scottish Land Commission, which I've been involved with since 2017. And it has a statutory ambit to undertake reviews, research, gather evidence, as almost as a think tank, a public sector body as a think tank on any aspect of land in Scotland. Strapline has been making more of Scotland's land, but you can see that the strategic plans, the two strategic plans that we've been working to, much wider than sort of just right to roam in the countryside or landed estates. They are looking at how ownership affects, for example, housing development, looking at land markets and how they work or how they don't work. And one of the key achievements, I think, of the Commission has been the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force. There's a huge amount of vacant and derelict land in Scotland, especially in West Central Scotland, and the total amount has not changed significantly for quite a period of time. And the Commission brought together stakeholders right across the piece to identify what the problem is and what needed to be done. And the Scottish Government subsequently committed £50 million to a vacant and derelict land investment fund. Again, just touching the surface of that, these sort of some of the types of communication that's used, but I'm not going to go in all that detail. It's just the headlines of what you need to do with vacant and derelict land include planning, but they're far wider than planning, and they tie planning into land reform and land policy. And they're about better use of data, thinking of land as part of the circular economy, supporting delivery through funding, stopping the flow of new vacant and derelict land, and tackling the legacy. And buried within there is the proposal for compulsory sale orders. Which originates from the Land Reform Review Group, the Land of Scotland and the Common Good, that thick document in 2014, that talks about the negative effects of people who keep their land and property vacant in cities when someone else could put it to beneficial use, and how that is against the common good, and propose, which has been accepted by the Scottish Government, the concept of compulsory sale orders that would enable local authorities in the end to get this land sold by public auction to someone who could make good use of it. So the Land Commission worked up a procedure for exactly how that might happen, and it's set in the context of the planning authority having this extra power to be able to negotiate with strength with owners. So it's not sort of slap a compulsory sale order on them eventually, but it is an entry point to try and bring the site into productive use. If that doesn't happen and an order is served, there is a process of appeal potentially. And if the planning authority's view is confirmed, there would then be a public auction and the land would be sold for the highest bidder. So what you have is a land reform measure that's consistent with the German Political Economist von Justi, who again Benjamin Davy talks about, who argues that although landowners have full liberty to use their land, they don't have the liberty not to use the land. The legislation is expected at some stage during the current Scottish Parliament, and is the kind of thing that would help solve case study number one, which is the Air Station Hotel. And then on the quite detailed paper from the Scottish Land Commission of how we address the perennial problem of housing shortages. And again, what is interesting here is it's a land reform, land policy approach. It's bringing together use, value and ownership rather than relying simply on planning instruments, and it contrasts sharply with those who argue that housing supply issues, all needed is further planning reform measures. Well, we've seen where they've got to, and we still have housing supply issues. It's taking a far more realistic approach to how you deal with some of these intractable problems. So I want to take two case studies of land reform in action in Scotland. And the first is the Mid-Steeple Quarter in Dundee. And you can see on the left, fairly run-down part of the city centre as it is, and a transformation as it will happen. And what we have is a transformation driven forward by a community benefit society founded by local artists. We have empty buildings in the process of being acquired both from the local authority and absentee property investors, ambitious refurbishment and redevelopment plans, and funded by public, private and charitable sources, including 178,000 from the Land Reform Fund in Scotland, the Land Reform. So at this stage, I'm going to play a little video, if we can do that.
The physical market town with no market, like a coal town that is long and pit. We wanted a thriving town centre, but like many high streets up and down the country, the thesis has been shot closed down and buildings become empty. Despite attempts, nothing seems to work to reverse the decline. With empty buildings, the perception of decline in the economic prospects of the town is revealed. The locals knew something had to be done, so we asked, how can we tackle the problem? A group of creative people at the Stoke Network asked their own questions and knew a diverse answer was required. A conversation with local people to shape an answer together as a community. A variety of public events and festivals, discussion sessions and writing groups. Each time an event was held, the results were brought back to the community through social media, a display at the Stoke Cafe and coverage in the local newspapers and radio. Keeping the communication going was key. A simple question, what do you think of Dumfries High Street? Bleak, empty, forgotten, boring, wasted, lost, a ghost town? But what if we could breathe new life into Dumfries Town Centre? Let's reimagine, reclaim, revitalise. Only 2 long-term residents live in the High Street. The town centre is a ghost town after the shops closed for the evening. So one idea had agreement across all the community interest group to bring people back to live in the town centre. 200 people signed up to their increased pledge, and a team to Norway was recruited to raise awareness and to carry out clean-up events. A new community organisation took form on the principle of community ownership. We could use the community and permanent policies of the Scottish Government to buy back our High Street. The High Street might not be a Highland estate or an island, but it is owned by absentee landlords too. And so the Mystical Quarter Community Benefit Society was launched, now 400 plus members strong, each owning an equal share in the project, and a board elected on their behalf. The council asset transfer of an empty building on the High Street, the Oven, was established as a community venue for consultation events, community, group, pop-up shops and exhibitions. Redevelopment proposals for the Oven were drawn up, funding was secured. A prototype to show what can be achieved with a community-managed building. A new building to contain enterprise activity, co-working, workshop and business space for start-ups, self-contained affordable apartments for rent, and an artist residency studio. A master plan for the whole quarter was prepared to envisage a mixture of reuse, redevelopment and new build to create a vibrant, housing-based and commercially active quarter. A sustainable new community, 8 buildings containing shop units on the High Street were identified and targeted for acquisition. Negotiations began. The local community are taking back control of their neglected High Street, reimagining it as a contemporary living, working, socialising, learning and enterprising quarter. A new beating heart that will be a catalyst to grow a new thriving and resilient town. Let's take it to the street, to where we all meet. We are the Mid-Steeple people, the Duntoon Army. Let's reclaim this town and release us from its shroud. This is my town, your town, our town, home. Make your voice be heard, let it be known. We stand together, one and for all, and we will rise before we fall. We are the people, the Dumfries people.
So what we have is the principles of land reform, translated from where they began perhaps in rural Scotland to urban Scotland. And we have the community, as I say, not being third parties, but actually being active participants and drivers. So let's come back to the case study I was involved in. And I'm pleased to say the outcome was a victory for the local community in this sense, not the sharks. But it was fighting the local planning authority all the way, because there was a sense in which they were going to give way, as they gave way on the previous site. The community then produced its own master plan. It used the land reform legislation to register a community right to buy. In other words, preventing the owner from selling on to anyone, even if they built houses. It tried a compulsory community right to buy. That was turned down, but actually it was the final straw that prompted the owner to sell, and the purchase was completed with a grant from the Scottish Land Fund, and the community is now in the basis of restoring that woodland. So let's turn to England, where there are some hopeful signs of land reform. We have the House of Lords report, actually quite narrowly focused on land use, but steering clear of any controversy on land ownership, not surprising. The Liverpool City Land Commission focused on making the best use of publicly owned land. There's a land commission set up, I understand, for Greater Manchester, although details are pretty scarce at the moment. So if we take the early signs in England, here are 4 projects that I suggest help rebalance the relationship between planning and ownership. They are both about a change in the culture of planners, but they're also obviously about a change in the structure of planning. They're not alternatives, they reinforce each other. The first one is about deliberately abandoning this position of anonymity and neutrality. Planners really need to discover who the owners are. Let's not simply talk about an owner or union estates, for example. Let's talk about a 2 million international property development company based in the Cayman Islands. Let's name them. The diagram is taken from an earlier research project that shows owner behaviour and motives very greatly between those who significantly encourage and those who significantly discourage development. Planners need to find out, be streetwise to understand owner behaviour and motivations. And a Glasgow Sheffield research team has recently published very interesting research on diversity, ownership, diversity and fragmentation, and how it can be a barrier to city centre resilience. That was picked up in a different way in the Dumfries example, and showing how policymakers have only limited understanding of owners and simply frequently distill that down to one broad category of developer and one broad category of landowner, based on a mistaken presumption that property owners are all the same. That's really no good as we move forward. Secondly, is operating smartly as market actors. Markets are not sort of some natural marvel that drop in the sky like the weather. They're constructed by people just like planners. They're constructed by people like planners. And there's a whole chapter in the Shaping Places book on how planners can act more smartly. Don't take markets for granted. Challenge the myths and mysteries, such as, for example, the concept of housing market capacity, that you can only build so many houses in a particular area at a fairly slow rate of build. Complete myth, let's challenge it. The Liverpool Land Commission suggested that there's no legal impediment to allocating land much more specifically for community energy, for social business, for community spaces, for green infrastructure. Realise the direct impact of planning on values. So there is the valuations of the site I talked about in Helensburgh at the beginning. And the key thing is that the open market value, even as amenity land, was 3 times existing use value. Why was that the case? It was the case because planning vacillation and planning indecision and planning flexibility had generated hope value and generated land speculation and made it far more difficult for the community to intervene and acquire the land. So let's have clear, precise land, I would argue with little flexibility, because flexibility very largely encourages land speculation. Deploy public land ownership creatively. A superb report done for the Land Commission by the Universities of Glasgow and Liverpool on the European experience of using public land. Argue for public land to be used in pursuit of policy objectives, not simply to be sold to the highest bidder. Make selective case for selective land acquisitions, and argue this, it is an investment. It's not a subsidy, it's not a loss-making activity. It actually brings a return, both a financial return and a social return to the area. Don't privilege power. The powerful are the main customers of the planning system. How do we lessen dependence on the powerful? And I think it's important to deliberately side with the Dumfries type of owners of this world, with community land trusts, with development trusts, with social enterprises, community businesses, community groups. Make life easier for them rather than more difficult, which actually was the Helensburgh experience. What about compulsory sale orders for England? Well, if you look at the current bill that Michael Gove is putting through Parliament, there's an interesting proposal for compulsory rental auctions, which is a not dissimilar proposal for empty units in town centres that a Conservative government is actually putting forward. So some of these ideas are not off the wall. And land value taxation has great potential for more
despite the crash, the talk is excellent and inspirational. So it doesn't matter the crash. I think that it is very pertinent, the talk, David, because we're in the bewilderment of the Michael Gove's and successive governments planning reform in England, or abundant reform. So in the last 24 months, I think we still don't know what is going on. But despite that, I think your talk is very inspirational to give us a reflection about what planners and planning can do, rather than really just led by the government to have all sort of thinking, and especially about how to redesign the institution and then reform, and that we need to dare and bold and to be assertive of the changes. So with all these inspirational ideas, we will open up for discussion. But I particularly want to invite Sarah Longlands to comment on things, because you mentioned about the Liverpool Land Commission, and Sarah is here. Sarah, do you want to say something?
Hi. Really, I found it really fascinating, and I mean, it brought back loads of memories of my own kind of PhD work, and thinking about planning and intersect with economic development in Middlesbrough and Cambridge. I guess one of the questions that really came through from me in this is, well, there's lots of different questions, but one is just something about how can we give local planning back a sense of purpose in this, and you know, kind of help local planning to reassert its agency, if you like, in these kinds of challenges that they're facing on a regular basis. Another question I think that we're grappling with, particularly in the Manchester context, is, you know, there's a lot of examples that you talked through in terms of vacant and derelict land. I think there's a real challenge in a place like Manchester, where suddenly land ownership is, you know, the city's booming. There's like buy to rent going up all over the place. how can you intervene effectively in that ownership context, try and in the public interest, I suppose, to avoid us ending up, you know, like London and probably not, and we probably already are there in parts of GM. And then a final sort of reflection or question is, I really hear you on that point about community, that's something that's really close to our heart at Clares. You know, how do communities really get a slice of the ownership action in this conversation? We've been really inspired by the work of the Scottish Land Commission and what's happening in Scotland. I think it's really interesting, loads of lessons for England. But how, I suppose the question would be about what is the role of local authority planning in helping communities to be active participants rather than sort of the recipients or the receiving end of planning decisions? And I think often that relationship between the local state and communities can be very variable, to say the least. So I guess there's a question in there too for me. But thanks, I found it really fascinating. And, yeah.
Do you want to take it?
Or do you want to answer this first?
Yeah. I could have included numerous case studies where things are actually working out well. And I think there's an issue about disseminating good experience and ways in which that is disseminated to people at the sharp end dealing with practical problems elsewhere. I think there's also, and it comes through the land rights and responsibilities statement, is statements of principle of what are the values that this local authority is trying to achieve. And that's where the Liverpool Land Commission is so interesting, because it's actually saying, it's almost standing back from day-to-day pressures and saying, what is this set of local authorities trying to achieve? What are the values? What are the goals? And let's put a marker down. And I think the issue is so many markers have faded away over the years. And so many things that I'm talking about would actually have been common sense 2 generations ago. But because there has been this attack, relentless attack for 40, 50 years, and every politician thinks that all we need to do to solve the world is to reform planning, that's been lost. So we need a place to stand, and we need to say what the values are and what the direction is. And there are examples there, and almost each local authority, each community probably needs to restate that.
Greg, there's a hand from Vincent. Vincent, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. David, great to see you.
Hi, Vincent.
And I thought last time I spoke to you, you said you retired from planning. So,
I have.
yeah, well, you ought to get back in, because your speech was wonderful, and it just so needed to be said what you've been saying. And you're not going to get away with it this time, when I'm going to come back to you separately and get you doing something that actually helps shape things down here. I want to touch on and get your view on it, because I agree with everything you said, which is not surprising, since what I know is what I've learned from you anyway. But the challenge I feel that I'd like to somehow get your focus on land reform to be embedded in is a concern that we call ourselves planners, but most planners don't produce plans. In England, it's desperate. Most authorities, like 60% or so, do not have a plan that is up to date. Half of those don't have any plan at all, and others have out-of-date plans, which are as useless as a waste bit of paper. And I'm saying that because, having been a system where the plan was kept up to date and reviewed and refreshed, I found that the plan was a great vehicle for actually market shaping. And I quote, and I draw upon your report, which talks about those 3 areas in which we get involved. One is leveling the playing field, one is moving the goalposts, and actually is actually about creating markets through the planning system, where there is no market. And that is done through the plan system. And I wondered whether you have thoughts on how we can link your thoughts about plant land reform and actually the process of plan making as opposed to plan development management, which is actually the big issue you've addressed. And I totally get, and on a personal level, I could tell you horrific stories of my personal engagement in England in trying to get a council and planners to act responsibly.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent, and I'm very pleased to hear from you. A couple of things. I mean, I think plans are actually an excellent entry point into this kind of debate, because they should be asking those broad questions. They should be trying to tie together at a broad level use, value and ownership. But I think that actually the problem is even worse than you suggest, which is, let me take Argyll and Bute, which is where the Helensville example is, where actually the plan, probably not as regularly updated as you might want, Vincent, but there was a team continually working on the updating of the development plan, and it was updated. The problem is the development management people ignored it. Yeah. And the development plan people might have been working in another planet. Yeah. So that the development management people simply saw it as a baseline for negotiations, if that. The community had put a lot of effort into engaging with the plan, because that's what they're told to do. And once it had gone through a public inquiry and the reporters had agreed and it had all been sorted out, the community thought they were home and dry. The difficulty was the development management people then thought they could do what they want with it. Yeah. So there is an issue of using plans creatively and regularly updating them, but there's also an issue, which I alluded to in the lecture, of taking them seriously within a local authority, because if you don't, all you have is cynical suspicion in a community that has spent a lot of time giving an input to a development plan and then gets ignored totally by the development management people. Thanks, Vincent.
Well, thank you very much. It's one that maybe I could take up with you later.
Thank you, Vincent. Okay, any question? Oh, Tony first and then Len. Tony, first. Yeah. Oh, they want this.
David, thanks. That was terrific, and it's really good to have your thoughts based on all those years of research and public policy engagement. What I really liked about it was you were talking about the realms of responsibility, the steps we can take that are really practical, and that struck me forcibly. I hesitate to say what I'm going to say next, but just to remind you of some work I did for your commission, which was looking at the experience in Germany and the Netherlands. And I was very struck by your example. Think about temporary land booking, where municipalities have the right to assemble land, put in the public investment in infrastructure, put in the public sector facilities, raise the value of the land, and then sell it back on condition that development takes place. Now, it's a rules-based system, but it seems to me from what you said, that's something we can do here. And then finally, Vincent got to me before. Vincent, thank you very much. And the other thing that's in that report is plan shape land values. Yeah. So let's have some plans. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's made a point about the lack of plans. They do shape land values, and we can do quite a lot of work to actually realise the potential effects by taking the things we can do now. We don't need the revolution, public ownership of land. There are lots of things we can do. Yeah.
I think what the Scottish Government has allowed us to do in the Commission is actually commission a whole series of really good people to do really good academic research with a practical bent. And that is all, there's a whole lot just on housing and vacant land. There's a huge much more on concentration of landed power and the Duke of Buccleuch and everyone else. But up until that, I mean, I think there has been, because of the way in which funding has been cut back, there's been a shortage of really hard research looking into these kinds of subjects. And I think that, I haven't said that, but that's one of the things. I think there is a huge agenda there for the academic community to open the areas up. So yes, I mean, please log on. There's Tony's report, there's a Glasgow, Liverpool report, there's a whole host more of very interesting things about how this kind of agenda can be put into practice.
Reminds me of a mind, I did research a little bit about vacant land and stalled sites, which is very, very interesting a few years ago. Technology a bit dangerous. It's all one of these questions really. Companies' house is free.
Yeah.
But ownership is incredibly opaque. What's the case for the land registry still charging £10 to find out who owns the property? Or is there no case now? And sorry, a technical question afterwards. I'm just wondering your views on it. But the depreciation of assets actually qualifies for tax relief. So if you, well, I don't know whether the landlords, presumably you are thinking of taxation now. The asset is depreciation, which could be paying another way. You see what I mean? Not tax against the depreciation, but being taxed for the depreciation.
I'm sure any well-advised landlord would find a way of doing what you're suggesting. In terms of the land registry, I think that is really, really interesting because one of the reasons of the market efficiency is lack of information. And it's not just, I mean, I do agree with you that the public benefit of making that information easily available far exceeds the revenue that would be lost to the government. But actually, it's a broader issue. It's about being able very easily to do so, and in that way to improve the efficiency of what's going on. There's in Scotland, there's a land reform campaigner who you probably come across called Andy Whiteman, who's written extensively on the point we're making about why on earth in this country as opposed to other countries you can actually get on what he says is you can get on the internet in Scotland and much more easily find out the ownership of pieces of land in Calgary than you can in Edinburgh.
There is a question from Joe West online. Joe, do you want to ask a question? All right. Oh, he's unmuting himself.
Hi, sorry, I'm coming in from Florence in Italy. I'm running some workshops here.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Good. Yeah, thanks. Yes. So the development game is not the same as it was 20 years ago, and it will not be the same in 20 years from now. And many of us are now considering the impact of AI in all of its very aspects, and how it plays out in the smart city, where services are organized around the individual needs and wishes of citizens, but also those of providers and also those of data collectors, and so on and so on. Now, nobody can really forecast how this is going to play out, but it's clear that planning is not necessarily going to be the same kind of operation in future decades as it has been up to now. As you rightly say, as a kind of servant handmaiden of the capitalist land ownership and development system. So if we feed in the wonderful community-based planning of Dundee and North Manchester and many other places around the country, and then say, oh, okay, the developers will be working very hard to stay several steps ahead in terms of real estate calculation, land value, use value, and so on and so on, as are the urban infrastructure providers. And in that sense, can the community-based planning keep up? Can the AI-enabled planners of the future really take on this agenda, where not only the landowners and developers are in this new sort of hyper-connected world, but also potentially the communities themselves. And we have to be aware that a community is not a thing. A community is like a set of relationships which may or may not manifest in any particular place. This is my experience. So if we took the Dundee example, which I think is wonderful, by the way, and then said, okay, can this be a model play out across the country? Is this viable? Does it need to change and adapt very rapidly? How do you see it working in 10 years or 20 years from now?
Yeah, I think there's, well, you're absolutely right, but I think back 20 years or longer than that ago, where when I was here, planners were trying to grapple with this new thing called business class, business use. What was it? Was it offices? Was it industrial? And a real struggle. And they were sort of 3 or 4 years behind the development community. I think there's an issue of to what extent is planning a learning profession? To what extent is it a bureaucratic profession? And they're not necessarily the same. And there's also the issue of what role academia plays in that, of creating knowledge and connecting knowledge through to those in practice. So I think what you've pinpointed is a real issue, and I think part and parcel of the way forward is to think through how knowledge is going to be created, how it's going to be shared, how it's going to influence action in a way that is not going to be swamped by the bureaucracy, because I see that as a huge problem. And whether that's the bureaucracy of the organisation or whether it's the bureaucracy of the development plan system, doesn't matter. I think there's a tension there that could be addressed. Anyway, thanks, Joe.
At this note, especially Bert is winking at me, is I think the discussion can carry on with the wine reception. So the alcohol definitely group to pose a lecture.
Cecilia, thanks. Colleagues, friends, I'm not here with my University of Sheffield hat on. I'm here with my Royal Town Planning Institute Trustee Board hat on and chair of the Education Committee. So I've been asked by the presidential team, that's Sue Bridge, this year's president, and Lindsay Richard, this year's vice president, to ask you to join me in saying happy birthday, Manchester University. Now, we're not going to sing it, but they both asked me to say how indebted we are as a discipline and profession to this university over so many years, sustained teaching, sustained thought leadership, and sustained research. So can we all say happy birthday, Manchester University, well done, and Mark and colleagues, keep going.